chime in if you are here for pesticide education, pesticide credits. Okay, good, because in the past I've done a presentation and I was not told that y'all wanted credits. So this is a credits presentation. So you're going to get 1 core and 1 category credit, category 18 credit today. So that's what we're going to do. So this is more of a professional development than a resources update. So I hope that's what y'all wanted. Please interrupt me, ask me questions, whatever you need, want, that kind of thing is great for me. So with that, I am going to get started. See if I can get my PowerPoint to work. So yeah, pesticide education program. We are going to talk about core first and then cover some category stuff. As always, you know, the fun, boring things that we like to talk about. So we're going to start off talking about PPE. So what is pesticide PPE? This is going to be your personal protective equipment, and it's going to comprise of the clothing and the devices that you wear to protect your body from contact with pesticides. This can include aprons, coveralls, gloves, footwear, headgear, eyewear, and respiratory protection. So who should wear personal protective equipment? When we're dealing with pesticides, we definitely want the mixer, the handler, the applicator, any workers. If you have any registered technicians under your supervision, which probably doesn't really apply to a lot of ag teachers because registered technicians are more found on like ornamental or landscape type situations where the boss has the license and then they certify their registered technicians. It's a little bit of a different certification, but it allows them to apply certain pesticides under supervision of their boss. But reality is essentially anyone who may have contact with the pesticide should be wearing personal protective equipment. So if you have a storage area and somebody has to go in there, you know, it's definitely putting on gloves when they enter that storage area is a great way to protect themselves in case there's any product on the outside of a container or, you know, they come across a spill. You never know what might happen. So anyone that's going to be near that pesticide, whether it's the product that's already been applied or that concentrate, should really be preparing themselves with personal protective equipment. So why wear PPE? You know, sometimes I feel this is like kind of a no-brainer, especially to a lot of audiences, but there's still, I find it's important to just remind ourselves why we want to wear our personal protective equipment. We really want to shield ourselves from exposure throughout the whole pesticide use activity. And there are 4 main types of pesticide exposure that can occur. So orally, so through the mouth, ocular through the eyes, inhalation through the nose, the lung system, and dermally through our skin. And really dermal exposure, so skin exposure, is going to be the most common type of pesticide exposure. And when we talk about the body, different parts of our body will absorb pesticides faster and a different percentage of that pesticide amount, depending on what part of that body we are talking about. And so this has a lot to do with our skin, our blood vessels, you know, what activity is happening. So ironically, the genital area is the area where most of 100% of any pesticide that comes in contact with that is going to be absorbed. So this is really why we focus a lot on washing hands. Following that, which I think is such an odd place, but it makes sense, the ear canal has almost 50% absorption rate, which is pretty high. And you think about like the ear canal, like how are you going to get pesticides in your ear canal? But I've started watching people sometimes when I give presentations or when I'm out, and how many times do we touch our ear, touch our face? You know, we do things that we're not even thinking about. And so when we're working with pesticides, we really need to be like on our game and not doing those like involuntary things, because we can expose ourselves if our hands or our forearms are dirty. So following the ear canal is the forehead and the scalp, and then the abdomen, the feet, our palms, and our forearms. So thankfully, the things things that we use the most when working with pesticides are hands, right? That's where our interaction really is primarily with the chemical. Our palms and our forearms are least absorptive in our body. So that does give us a little bit of protection, but we still want to continue that protection because again, you get that product on your hands. Your hands might not be absorbing it, but you touch your face, you go to the bathroom, other parts of your body then are going to be absorbing a lot of that pesticide. So one of the main ways that we can have direct exposure to pesticides is through faulty PPE. So if we're failing to clean our reusable PPE properly, or if we're reusing personal protective equipment that's supposed to be disposable, you know, disposable products are not waterproof. They're not to be washed, and they are never good for more than 8 hours of use. And so here it kind of looks like this backpacked gentleman has a strap hanging down, but reality is that it's a piece of duct tape. You know, he split his Tyvek suit, and how do you fix it? Duct tape, right? Duct tape fixes everything. So reality, that is not a good practice. I know there are times in the real world where we're in a situation where we can't control what happens. So we want to prepare you, hopefully, to be prepared and have, you know, a second Tyvek suit in the truck, in the pesticide shed, in the greenhouse, wherever you're at. You have an extra suit in case something like this does happen, because you should never continue to apply pesticides in your Tyvek suit with duct tape on it, because you basically have voided it and it is not protecting you in any way, shape, or form. So we can prevent pesticide exposure through faulty PPE by inspecting our PPE before we use it. You know, we want to make sure that if we're using reusable PPE, the gloves don't have holes in them, the suits don't have tears, there's not product stains or residue on them. And we want to clean and inspect our PPE after using it. That is, of course, if it's reusable. If it's disposable, it goes straight into the hazardous waste bin. We want to make sure we know the limitations of our PPE. You know, if anybody's familiar with multiflora rose, if you're going out to do a multiflora rose application with a backpack sprayer on, are you wearing a Tyvek suit like this gentleman has on? No, because within minutes of coming in contact with that multiflora rose, that Tyvek suit is just going to be ripped to pieces. So you're better off in some sturdy coveralls, you know, some sort of heavier material that's going to protect you better than this Tyvek suit that's now full of holes from the multiflora rose. So we want to make sure we understand the limitations of our PPE, and anything that looks faulty or just doesn't seem right, we want to make sure we are disposing of it. So a few PPE good practices: make sure that we are using durable and resistant products that are going to be not really susceptible to punctures or tears during normal use. And you also want your PPE to be comfortable enough without restricting your movement. You don't want to be wearing a Tyvek suit that you can't like move. I hope you know what I'm trying to say. You know, it's so tight, you don't have that arm movement. You want to be able to be comfortable, because if you're not comfortable, you're probably not going to wear it properly. So you want to make sure you're comfortable so that you are wearing it properly and you have that movement that you need. And something that I find very interesting is, back in college, I worked at the Penn State dairy farm. And so we wore gloves when we would milk cows, and we would use iodine and manure. And a habit I got into was wiping my hands on my pants. You know, the gloves get a little dirty. It's no big deal. You wipe your hands on your pants, right? Well, that is such a bad habit, because we do not ever want to be doing that with our dirty, contaminated pesticide gloves. We never want to wipe our contaminated gloves on our clothing. And so again, that's a habit that you almost have to work to break, because you do it without even thinking sometimes. And so we want to try and bring those actions to our awareness, to our attention, so we're not contaminating ourselves. And again, I know I sound like a broken record, but you always want to replace damaged PPE. And so we know this, but the proper use of a pesticide begins with reading the label. And guess what? That's where you're going to find your PPE information too. Anybody know where in the label you will find PPE information? Well, you typically find it under the precautionary statement section. So that's going to be within the first 2 pages, depending on the size of the label. If it's a teeny tiny little label, it might be on the 3rd page, but precautionary statements are pretty close to the front of that label. And that is where our personal protective equipment requirements are going to be listed. And there are times where there's going to be requirements for applicators. There's going to be times when there's just requirements for mixers and loaders. So you want to make sure you read that and really understand what those PPE requirements are. And the reality is we want to do this every time we go to use a pesticide. You should be reading that label and reminding yourself of your PPE requirements. And I want to bring this up because this product, Garlon 3A, it's an herbicide. It's good for like woody, weed control, roadsides, pastures, that kind of thing. So Garlon 3A, this is its PPE requirements. So we have long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes plus socks, eyewear, and chemical resistant gloves. But Garlon 4 is a slightly different formulation and concentration, and it only requires a long sleeve shirt and long pants and shoes plus socks. So if you've been using Garlon 4 and switch to Garlon 3A and you don't read the label, you are very much under protecting yourself when you're using Garlon 3A if you're following the Garlon 4 PPE requirements. So same name, but just slightly different formulation, much different PPE requirements. So we always want to make sure we're checking that label before we do our pesticide application. And the label is going to list the minimum PPE that is required by the applicator, the handler, the early entry worker. It's the minimum. Always feel free to wear more. You know, that's something I like to say. So if we go back to that Garlon 4 label, it only requires long sleeve shirt, long pants, and shoes plus socks. Okay. It does not require gloves, but I will always recommend gloves. Regardless of what that label says, put on some gloves. It's just that extra layer of protection that if you can, you know, throw on those gloves, you're just giving yourself a little bit extra level of protection. And I think maybe by putting on those gloves, you're going to help reduce those involuntary touches, you know, touching the face, digging in the ear, scratching, whatever. Those gloves may help prevent those, so you're not going to be transferring pesticides to other parts of your body. So our basic PPE is what we call standard work clothing, and that is going to be a long sleeve shirt, long pants, closed-toed shoes, and socks. This is really a minimum of using any pesticide. And your clothing should be made of tightly woven fabrics. It should be durable and in good condition. I can imagine as ag teachers, you've probably seen students in your school wearing jeans that have rips like from thigh to mid-calf, right? So we don't want to be wearing jeans like that when we are doing pesticide applications. That just is going to expose us to too much pesticide. So we want to make sure that our clothes are in good condition. And any clothing that's worn when handling or applying pesticides should be separately laundered and stored. So you don't want to be taking that home and washing that with the family's laundry. You can wash it in the family's washing machine, but you do not want to be washing it with that family laundry. And if you have questions about laundering pesticide clothing, please get a hold of me. I have lots of resources on the steps and the protocols. So quickly, I just want to talk a little bit about gloves, because really, you know, a lot of the products we're working with either going to call for gloves, and if they don't, I still think you should wear gloves. Like that's like my soapbox. It's just wear the damn gloves. You know, that's what I tell people. Like I just, you know, just do it. It's not going to, it doesn't hurt you. It's helping you. So wear the gloves. But we want to make sure that we are wearing the proper gloves. And so if the label just says to wear chemical resistant gloves, you've got lots of options. It's really no big deal. You want to make sure you're wearing a glove that's going to resist the active ingredient. You know, we know thick gloves are going to offer more protection, but we also know that the thicker the glove, sometimes the harder it is to work with. So you really want to try and find that balance, that middle ground. So you have that dexterity, you have the ability to work and do what you need to in your gloves, and you want them to fit. So I always say, if you can't put together a basic Lego design with your gloves on, they're too big. You know, if you can't pick up some basic Legos, I'm not talking about the really complicated things, but a basic Lego thing, if you can't build, then your gloves are too big. So you want to make sure that your gloves fit, and you want to find that balance between thickness and the ability to use them. Some labels will specify specific glove materials. And so you want to make sure that you are using what that label specifies, because the chemicals or the inert ingredient, something in that pesticide formulation obviously can break through a normal glove. And so they're going to recommend a specific special type of glove. So again, our best choices for gloves are typically the ones made from plastic. So our nitrile, our PVC, our neoprene, our butyl rubber, and our Viton. So again, it's not important that you understand the differences between these types. Know that the plastic material gloves are going to be your best choice. And if the label specifies a glove type, make sure you are using that specific type of glove. And so something I always joke about, I use joke with my air quotes, you know, how do you remove your gloves without touching them? Of course, I always get people that joke and say they use their teeth, and we know that's not a good idea. So when we're removing our gloves, we want to, and I always say in the best case, or the real, no, what do I say? In the perfect world, that's what I'm looking for. In the perfect world, we are going to always have access to soap and hot water. But in the real world, we know this is not always the case. So in the perfect world, you want to wash your gloves with soap and hot water, and then rinse them, and then remove them and wash your hands and arms again with that soap and hot water. But in the real world, we don't always have that option. So if you can have at least some water and some sort of soap type product out, if you're out in the field or wherever you're at, and you're able to at least, you know, try and rinse those gloves before you take them off, you're going to help yourself in the long run and reduce your pesticide exposure. And always, before you eat, you drink, you smoke, you put that cell phone up to your face, you know, we want to make sure that we are washing our hands with soap and hot water and our forearms to protect ourselves from any potential residues that may be on our hands. Footwear, you know, for the most part, we're just talking about standard closed-toed shoes and socks. Chemical resistant footwear is going to be the best option, and even something that you can actually rinse or hose off would be perfect. But again, that's not always convenient or something that we are able to do, you know, wash our footwear. If you are not able to wear chemical resistant footwear, they make these awesome PPE little booties, you know, kind of like the biosecurity boots that we wear on farms. You know, you put something like that on to cover your footwear if necessary. And if you have to walk back through the treated area, you want to make sure your boots at least come up to your ankle and preferably halfway to your knee if you have to be walking through a treated area. Okay, that's pretty important because sometimes we don't think about that. You know, if we have to walk back through that pesticide application, you want to make sure you're protecting yourself a little bit extra. I know this is a no-brainer, but I remind applicators. I talk to a wide audience of applicators, so I always like to remind them that sandals should never be worn when applying pesticides, or Crocs. I always throw in Crocs because Crocs sometimes seem to show up every so often. People are wearing Crocs. So you always want to be wearing some sort of closed-toed shoe. Leather and canvas boots will absorb pesticides. So if you are unable to wear those chemical resistant footwear, cover them with a bootie, or designate that pair of shoes specifically for pesticide application only. There are some labels for products that require individuals to walk, long distances, maybe doing right of way or power line type applications. So there are exceptions there that allow for leather boots. But again, the label's always going to say that chemical resistant closed-toed shoes. And you should try and never wear that footwear home after that application, because it is going to have that pesticide residue on it. If possible, set those shoes out in the sun. The sun will break down some of that remaining pesticide that might be on those shoes before you would wear it somewhere else. And, coveralls, you want them to be loose fitting. You want them to come, some sort of cotton or twill if they're reusable, or the disposable Tyvek suit we use. Again, make sure if you are wearing the disposable coveralls, you're throwing them away afterwards. They're disposable. And we want to be cautious, when it's hot out, excuse me, or, if you're working in a greenhouse situation where there's a higher heat or higher humidity, wearing these extra layers and these non-breathable Tyvek coveralls can really set you up for heat stroke or heat stress. So, make sure you're taking steps to stay cool, but also protecting yourself. And who wants to wear coveralls on hot, sunny, humid days? So we found this cool little thing that you can wear. Basically, it's going to cover the areas where this gentleman is, doing a backpack spray, and he's protecting his legs. So any, drift or anything that would possibly get on his clothes is going to be protected by they're like chap type pants. And he has a vest on. And what's really cool, unfortunately, you can't see it in these images, is the vest has a long back to it. And so if that backpack sprayer would happen to leak or splash, there is protection there so that it's going to drip off of you instead of running down like the back of your pants, because nobody wants that. And plus, what's cool about this vest is it's got padding too for holding that backpack sprayer on. Just a quick note, if your label requires eye protection, it's going to be specific about what type of eye protection you may need. Sometimes it's going to suggest a face shield. Sometimes it's going to suggest goggles. Really, we're concerned about our highly corrosive products and making sure we're protecting our eyes. And there are times when you need tight fitting goggles, not just eye protection. So make sure you're reading and understanding that what that label is requiring. With our goggles, we want splash and spray proof goggles. They don't want side vents. And so that can always complicate things, because that can lead to some fogging, making it maybe a little bit hard to see. And whenever you're using goggles, if you have that rubber strap, you want a rubber strap. And if you're using something that's not rubber, you want to make sure that you are changing that strap out frequently, because it can absorb those pesticides. And just a quick side note, if you are using a pesticide that requires eye protection, you also need to have some sort of eye wash station, dispenser, access to a flow of water that would qualify as an eye wash center. So just kind of to wrap up our PPE, no one material or barrier is going to work for all pesticides, so you want to make sure you're reading the label. There are no standard solvents used by PPE manufacturers to test PPE, and we're realizing there's very little chemical data available about pesticides and what all is in that inert ingredients or secret formula. So you want to use your best guess, use your best knowledge. And if you find that the PPE you're using is not lasting like it normally does because you're using a new pesticide, change it out, choose a different product. And the higher the temperature, the faster that pesticide is going to be able to break down and break through your PPE. So we know that even the best chemical protective clothing will perform poorly if it's torn, cut, or somehow compromised. So, make sure your PPE is functioning, looking good, good quality. Don't use something that's got holes or tears or looks just a little off. If your gloves look a little fishy, get a new pair. So any questions on PPE? Okay, we're gonna run through pesticide storage quick and then do some category talk, and you guys will get your credits. So pesticide storage, again, to me, these concepts are very obvious and most of us understand them, but it's still something that we feel the need to, remind people about. We want to make sure that our storage is secure. We want to try to keep it locked if possible when not in use. So whether that's, locking a building or locking a cabinet, you want to reduce access to those pesticides just to prevent exposure. And we want to post warning signs, because if there would be a fire, we want to make sure that that area is designated as pesticide storage for safety, not only for your safety, but for firefighter safety. And, if there is a fire, you don't really want to put a pesticide storage area fire out with water, because all of that water would be considered hazardous and would need to be disposed of properly. So there are specific requirements for dealing with pesticide fires. So we want to just designate that area so people know that that's what's there in the case of an emergency. We want to prevent water damage, because nothing makes for a bad day than ruining a pallet of dry pesticide with a water situation. So you want to, make sure you're not storing them in an area that's likely to flood, or you're going to get runoff maybe from the roadside culvert. Try and store the pesticides on raised pallets or on shelves if possible, especially in a large situation like this. I know most of us aren't storing this amount of pesticides, but any dry product you should really be keeping off the ground. Certain pesticides require certain temperature for storage, so you want to make sure you're checking your label so you know if the product you're using requires a temperature controlled environment. And you want your area to be well ventilated with exhaust fans, so that any vapors that may come off of any, like product that might be on the outside of the container, that kind of thing, is able to exit the building. You want to make sure you have adequate lighting in your storage area so that you can see the label and read it, but also so any leaks or damages to your containers, your storage, can be identified and taken care of right away. We want to use non-porous materials in our storage area, so cement or other impervious floor materials. We don't want carpet, dirt, that kind of thing. We want metal or some sort of non-absorbent plastic materials for shelving. And in a very large storage area, you should have a curved floor with a sump pump, because you don't want any of that product actually going, through a normal drain system, because those pesticides can get out into the environment then. And one thing we like to suggest, even for small storage, is to use some sort of what we call secondary containment. So putting your pesticide containers into these like aluminum trays. If that jug decides to spring a leak, you're going to be able to catch a lot of that product. It's going to save you from the hassle of trying to clean it up. Plus, some of these products are pretty expensive. And so, if you capture it in that aluminum tray, you can actually pour it into a properly labeled service container and continue to use it. But if it ends up all over the floor, you're not able to pick that up and reuse it. You should only be storing pesticide containers, pesticide equipment, and spill kit cleanup in your pesticide storage area. You don't store your PPE with your pesticides. You want to store them separately, because you need access to that PPE before you access the pesticide storage area. And you should never keep food, drink, tobaccos, feed, medication, medical or veterinary supplies, seeds, or clothing in your pesticide storage area. You really should designate it just for pesticides. And I'm talking even in a small situation, just like a little cabinet that you can close. That's fine. That might be in the shed with all the other things, but at least you're keeping just the pesticides in that cabinet and you're keeping it locked. I hope that makes sense. And you want to keep your storage area organized. I know that's kind of silly and doesn't really make sense, but if it's organized enough that you know where to find things and you're keeping similar products together. So if you're using herbicides, you've got all the herbicides in one area, all the fungicides in another area, all the insecticides in another area. That's really helpful. And never food or drink items in your pesticide storage area. We want to keep our labels legible. It's important that you can read the label. If something happens to your label, you want to make sure you're marking your container. By law, you have to mark that container with the trade name, the EPA registration number, the signal word, so whether that's caution, warning, danger, or danger, poison, and whether that pesticide is general or restricted use. And once you do that, then you need to make the efforts to obtain a replacement label and attach that to that container. We want to be storing our pesticides only in their original containers or in a properly labeled service container. So in Pennsylvania, we can utilize service containers. So if you're working out of a big, like 50-gallon drum, you can put it into a smaller container, the product. But again, make sure you're labeling it with those 4 things. And again, you should never store pesticides in food or beverage containers. We already talked a little bit about this secondary containment. We want to make sure our containers are closed. We want to use our non-absorbent shelving. Again, heavier products on the lower shelves, lighter products on the top shelf. Store liquids below our dry products, because if we have liquids above and it springs a leak, it can ruin our dry products. This is really not important to us. I don't think any of us are storing massive pallets or drums of pesticides, but if you do, put them on plastic pallets. You want to have a reinforced concrete pad and some sort of diking system that is going to be able to cover the volume of that tank plus 10% is a requirement for large container pesticide storage. You want to look for damage. You want to inspect your containers for tears, splits, rust, corrosion, or other problems. And if you do find them, of course, you want to put your PPE on. You want to put that damaged container into a larger container, clean up your spills, and, if possible, you want to try and use that product as soon as possible, because that container is just not going to give you the longevity that you want for storage. It's important to maintain an inventory of your pesticide storage. Make sure you know what all you have on hand. You want to, if possible, you can mark your container with the purchase date. Some products have a shelf life, so it's important to know, really how long you have to use that product up. We always recommend using the oldest products first. Review your labels, I would say yearly, possibly more if you're using the pesticides frequently, just to make sure that that label, is readable. And just a few safety tips. It's always recommended to have multiple copies of the labels. So not only the label that's on the jug, but you can print copies off and keep it in a binder, maybe in the office. Because again, if there is some sort of pesticide emergency, you have copies of that label to provide to first responders. Always wear the appropriate personal protective equipment when dealing with pesticides. If you're using some sort of measuring device, make sure you label it that for pesticide use only. We don't want to be using the same measuring cup that we use to measure out our pesticides to scoop the cat food kind of thing. Make sure you're labeling it for pesticide use only. You want to have cleanup materials on hand. And it's important to read your SDS sheets for information on how exactly to deactivate a pesticide spill. A few more safety tips. We want to make sure we have access to clean water, soap, paper towels, eye wash station, PPE, chemical fire extinguisher, first aid equipment, and emergency phone numbers. Again, this is the perfect world. There are situations where in the real world this is not possible, but if you can be prepared and have these things at least somewhere near your pesticide storage area, that's awesome. If you have unwanted or waste products, there are a variety of state programs that will help with disposing of them. So if you are in a situation where you have products that you need to be disposed of, please reach out to me. There's a program called Chem Sweep that Pennsylvania offers. It rotates counties every couple years that you can use to dispose of unwanted or out of date or just weird pesticides that are no longer usable. Questions on PPE or storage? Nope. Awesome. All right, we have like 20 minutes-ish, and we're going to just run through some category 18 weeds. We're going to talk about weeds. Might be relevant to you, might not be, but we figured it was a good thing for us to just cover for category 18. So weeds are going to compete with our ornamental plants, our field crops, you know, anything that we are growing for water, light, and nutrients. So a lot of times in our ornamental plants or even in our field crops, our weeds are going to harbor insect or disease problems that can damage our desirable plants. And some of our weeds actually produce phytochemicals in their root system that are going to inhibit the growth of other plants. So this is a reason why weeds can be such a problem in various growing situations. And of course, weeds have rapid reproduction, they seed, they take over pretty quickly, and some of them actually have perennial structures, whether that's in their root system or just in the way that they grow, that are going to make them very difficult to control once they get established. So a lot of times with weeds, it's better if we can get them controlled in the beginning. So weeds are going to typically produce a large quantity of seeds. And so for effective weed control, we want to make sure we are understanding the weeds and how they work, and also the products that we are going to use. So there are 3 types of weeds that we typically find. We find broadleaf, grasses, and sedges. And so our broadleaf weeds are going to be weeds that typically have broad leaves with one main vein, with a variety of other smaller veins branching out. So a typical broadleaf plant would be something like alfalfa or a sunflower or a dandelion. So a maple tree is a broadleaf plant. So broadleaf can be weeds and it can be plants. So it can be desirable or undesirable. These type of plants are going to have a fibrous or taproot type system. A lot of times they're going to have colorful flowers when we're talking about weeds specifically, and they can be hard to control. Our grassy weeds are going to have straight, narrow leaves with parallel veins. So we're thinking about Bermuda grass, Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, fescue, crabgrass. Even corn is a grass plant. So a corn plant in a soybean field is technically a grassy weed. Our stems are going to be round or flat, and they're typically going to have a fibrous root system. And then the last type is a sedge. So a sedge is kind of grass-like, but it actually has a triangular shaped stem versus our grass plants that are going to be flat or round. It actually has a triangular shaped stem, which is pretty neat. Sedges are typically going to be yellow-green in color, and they do spread by seed, but also by little tubers that they grow under the ground. And so really, I think a lot of times sedges, we're going to be finding those in kind of more wetter areas. They're more of a poorly drained, wet type soil weed. So how do herbicides control weeds? So our active ingredient and the formulation and the application itself is going to affect how our herbicide controls a plant. Some herbicides are only going to affect the plant itself. Other herbicides will actually affect the plant and the surrounding soil. Some herbicides have long-lasting effects, so you're going to get residual control over many months, where others are going to break down very quickly in the soil. So when we talk about herbicides, we want to talk about the mode of action. So an herbicide's active ingredient is going to affect the way that the weed grows and how it's going to develop in different ways. And there are a variety of different modes of action, and we're not going to talk specifically about different ones, but I just want to bring up that it is a thing. And so there are modes of action that will inhibit photosynthesis. So the plant will actually almost bleach white, and it basically starves to death because it is not able to photosynthesize anymore. And then there are some that are disrupt plant cell growth, kind of like this picture here. You can see how that plant's kind of twisted up a little bit. So basically, it almost, I'm gonna say, I just lost my words. It almost causes like cancer in that plant, where it causes it to just grow rapidly out of control, and it ends up twisting and distorting that leaf. And again, it grows so much that it ends up killing itself. So these are just two ways that herbicides affect a plant and cause it to end up killing, dying, ending its life. But there are a lot of different modes of action out there. So it's important when we're choosing the right herbicide that we know the characteristics of the different herbicides that we're thinking about. And we want to make sure that we're choosing the one that's going to work best for us and for our situation. Because a lot of times, if you pick the wrong herbicide or you do the application incorrectly, you can either not get the control you want, or it's possible that you will damage desirable plants, the things you don't want to harm. So when we go to choose our herbicide, we want to consider these 8 characteristics, or these 4 categories. So we want to understand if we want pre-emergence or post-emergence, systemic or contact, selective or non-selective, and residual or non-residual. So we're going to cover those things right now. So pre-emergence herbicides are going to be applied to the soil before the weeds appear. And basically, they're going to inhibit the growth as the weed germinates. And it creates a barrier on the soil surface. We find that this is the main method for controlling annual weeds, so plants that come up every year from seed. This works really well with grasses, and we tend to use it a lot in ornamental situations. We may use it in some field crop situations, but a lot of times it's used more in ornamental flower beds, that kind of thing, versus out in large scale agricultural production. A lot of times our pre-emergent herbicides will create a barrier on that soil surface that will last for several months. While our post-emergent herbicides are going to be applied after that weed has germinated and started growing. And the plants need to be young and actively growing for best results. So there are times when you may have a weed problem, but if you're experiencing a drought and that weed is not actively growing, and you apply that herbicide, you will not get good control, because a lot of times these herbicides need to be interacting with that plant's system, with the way the sugars and everything's moving in the xylem and the phloem and all of that good stuff. And so if that plant is not doing that very well because it's in stress or in drought, you're not going to get good control. So then the second category was systemic versus contact. So systemic herbicides are herbicides that are actually translocated, meaning they move throughout the plant. So they're going to provide control by moving throughout the plant, even if they're only applied to just one part. So we tend to use this when we're controlling perennial weeds. So things that live longer term, things that are around multiple years, things that don't die, complete their life cycle in 1 year. Because the systemic herbicide is going to be able to move from those leaves down into that plant root system and allow for better control. But we need to time that application correctly too. So think about like late summer, early fall. What is that perennial plant doing? It is trying to store sugars for winter, for next spring to really get started. So that's a great time to apply a systemic herbicide to these perennial plants, because they're going to pull that herbicide down into that root system and allow for some better control of that pest. Contact herbicides, though, work directly on the green plant parts that they come in contact with. So this is when we need good coverage of that plant to be effective. And one of the struggles with our contact herbicides is that they are not selective, meaning they control anything that they come in contact with. So we need to be very cautious that we're not harming the plants that we want in our habitat or in our environment or setting, whatever word we want to use. And so an example of a contact herbicide is Roundup. Okay, you're probably familiar with it. You've heard the word Roundup, glyphosate. It is a contact herbicide. It will kill whatever it comes in contact with, within reason. Of course, there's a few exceptions, but that's what allows scientists, they created the Roundup Ready crops. So those crops have a special protection in them that basically, even though they have contact with that herbicide has been made, they have the ability to protect themselves from it. Because if it wasn't Roundup Ready corn and you applied Roundup to that field, you would kill all of the corn. So then we have selective herbicides. So selective herbicides are going to only target a specific plant type. Typically, we're going to have herbicides that target broadleaf plants or herbicides that target grass plants. And so making sure we understand the biology of our plant is important. Is it a grass? Is it a broadleaf? Will also help with the selection of our selective herbicide. And then, of course, like I said about Roundup, there are non-selective herbicides that are going to control any plant that it comes in contact with. So this is really good if you are trying to create bare ground or you're trying to renovate an area. And so you're going to want to do total plant control. You would want to use a non-selective herbicide to just control everything. We see this a lot in no-till farming in the spring when we have that burn down treatment, if you've heard that word before, where basically the farmer goes out and does a non-selective broad spectrum herbicide application across that field. That cover crop that may have been growing is going to be controlled, and any weeds that have started to grow have been controlled. And you get that like browning, and then a couple days later you see corn starting to grow in it. So that's when a non-selective herbicide would be used. Residual herbicides are going to stay in the soil for longer periods of time. So we want to use them when we want long-term plant control. They will control new plants and sometimes existing mature plants too. So you have to be cautious about what residual herbicide you're using, because it may, if it gets too close to a plant that you don't want to die, it may still control it. So you want to be cautious about what residual herbicide you're using and where you are placing it. And even thinking about water flow. So if you're using it in a bed near the house, does the rain spout, discharge into that bed? Because if you get a washing storm, that rain spout may wash some of that pesticide into an area that you don't want control to happen. And then our non-residual herbicides, they don't last very long. So a lot of times we have multiple applications that are done to achieve weed control. And again, we use that for that burn down of weeds before we're installing or planting new plants. Timing is very important. You want to understand when to apply that herbicide. And a lot of that has to do with the life cycle of the weed. If you're working with an annual, you want to control it early when it has started to grow. You don't want to wait for it to be mature and sprouting seed. If that plant has already gone to seed, it is dying anyways because it's an annual. So it's really not even worth your efforts for control. If it's a perennial, you may want to hit it in the spring to reduce its growth rate, but then you also want to hit it again with that herbicide in that August, September timeframe to really pull that pesticide down into the root system and get better control. So in spring, we're going to be using pre-emergent herbicides to control those summer annuals, biannuals, and any perennials that may be sprouting up from seed, because they do come from seed sometimes. And we're also going to be using a post-emergence herbicide on any weed seedlings that maybe have escaped our pre-emergence. They got through, we didn't get it down in time, that kind of thing. We can use our post-emergence for that control. In summer and fall, we want to be mostly using we're only going to be using pretty much post-emergence. This is good for our perennial weeds because that's when they're going to be most susceptible to that pesticide application. And you can use pre-emergent herbicides for winter annuals that do tend to grow late in the fall and early in the spring here in Pennsylvania. Just something to think about. Herbicide resistance is a thing. You know, plants and nature and evolution has allowed some of these plants to get smart, not literally smart, but they, you know, genetics has allowed them to develop some resistance. So if you're in an area where there is certain weeds that are resistant to various herbicides, you know, you want to make sure that you are rotating your herbicide mode of action and you're using different products so that you are able to take all of the weeds that you are dealing with. Okay, so that's it for me. What I need you to do, if you want pesticide credits, I need your name, your date of birth, your email address, and your pesticide applicator number. And you can choose to put that in the chat, or you can email it to me at guc123@psu.edu. And I will take questions.
Jenny, I have a question.
Yes.
So it's actually regarding your presentation this morning in the business meeting, and you were discussing about 18-year-olds being the age for gaining a pesticide applicator license.
Mm-hmm.
I just spoken with someone via email this spring about giving the exam in my classroom. So I just found out recently that that's a thing, and as a teacher I can do that.
Right.
And I didn't know that before. And I asked her about the age, and she said that a 17-year-old could take the exam. So
they can
verify that, or should I go back to her? Because I had a 17-year-old who was turning 18 soon, and she said 17-year-olds could take it.
So you cannot be licensed unless you are 18. But I am guessing that she was saying that the 17-year-old could take the test and then they will wait until they turn 18 to receive that license. So that would be my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Genevieve, we've got a question from Kayla. Kayla, you're free to unmute and ask yourself if you like, but Kayla asks, do you have any resources similar to this, but on overall IPM?
Yes, Kayla, we definitely do. John, real quick, will you be able to get me the copy of the chat box?
Absolutely.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, we do have IPM resources. We have presentations. We have various other types of information. Are you looking for something specific regarding like greenhouse or just general IPMs?
General, but a lot more in the greenhouse. So I have soil and aquaponics together. So IPM is like very, very necessary because so much of it can be toxic to fish on the pesticide side of things. But yeah, just some general information on IPM too.
Yeah, if you want to email me, GUC123 on the screen, and I can definitely put together some resources that we have. And, you know, if you're interested, we can work on, you know, doing some sort of IPM lesson. I would love to come down. Once fall comes, Penn State should be we should be back to traveling. So I would love to come and, you know, even work with you or your students if that's something you might be interested in. I've been to Big Springs a couple times and I do an IPM lesson for them.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions for me?
Hi there, Genevieve. So I'm in the classroom, and so we all had to mute our things at the same time. I'm a pre-service student, so I'm going in my senior year at Penn State, majoring in agriculture and extension education. And I noticed, I don't know if this is in your realm of work, but I noticed looking through Workday that there are job postings for pesticide educators, throughout Pennsylvania and so forth. And I know that these teachers here, we don't want to take them out of the classroom and so forth, but to the best of your knowledge, what is our personnel needs at Penn State for pesticide educators? And I can share that information, with the folks that I go to school with.
Yeah, so all Penn State Extension educators, not all, but a lot of them that work in plants, any sort of plant type products, are going to do some pesticide education on their own. Specifically myself with the pesticide education program, we just hired 2 people, and I believe we have 1 more opening we may be posting in the future, but it's not specifically with Penn State and pesticide education. We're grant funded from the Department of Agriculture. There are so many of us on staff, and we do a variety of pesticide education things. I specifically focus on, one of my additional tasks is working with the public and with teachers, which is why you guys tend to see me more than anyone else. Now at the Department of Agriculture, there definitely may be needs for pesticide educators, but I think they call them agronomic product inspectors, or they have different titles than pesticide education specifically. So the need is not huge, but there is still definitely a demand for it. And probably one of the biggest holdups for anyone that would graduate with an ag and extension education degree is Penn State Extension likes people with masters. And so if you just have a bachelor's and there's somebody that has a master's, that person with that master's is looked at more, because a lot of these jobs are master's preferred. And sometimes we're looking for people that have experience, maybe not education. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.